Okay, so this week I wanted to talk to you about the idea of supportive care. Supportive care is kind of a largely ignored but very large part of human health care, a very large factor in the overall process of people taking care of each other. And this would be the sort of thing like when somebody is sick and you're taking care of them, you're not necessarily healing their sickness or anything like that. You're just kind of helping them through it. So this could be a situation where somebody has a self-limited illness and just needs some nurturing during it, or it could be a situation where someone has a terminal illness and you're doing what you can to make them as comfortable as possible. But overall, the thing that makes it supportive care is that you're trying to nurture and comfort them and not necessarily trying to the goal is not necessarily about treating a disease or curing the person or anything like that. And to some extent, all herbal medicine is supportive care. But I'm speaking in this case specifically of situations that might also be called palliative care in some contexts, where you would just be sort of treating symptoms, supporting bodily functions, nurturing the person, and trying to give ease and comfort. And this is something that, if you're a parent or if you've had to take care of other people in any other aspect of your life, maybe taking care of aged people or taking care of other people that you were responsible for, this is something that you very likely had to do, something a lot of us have had to do. In clinical practice, it kind of gets ignored. It's not necessarily, when somebody comes in to see me at the clinic, I'm not doing directly supportive care for helping them get through illnesses. I might be telling them about how to do it. I might be telling family members about how to do it, but it's not as much a part of clinical practice, so it often gets ignored. The profession of nursing largely grew out of people just doing supportive care, and it became, sort of more codified and professionalized as the years went by and became its own licensed profession eventually. The word nurse in English is, among its multiple meanings, is, taking care of someone while they're ill, like nursing them back to health, that sort of thing. And the word itself is basically a variation of the word nourish. It comes from the same Latin and Old French roots as the word nourish. It's just sort of like a shortening or a slightly different pronunciation of the same concept. So that's what you're doing when you're doing supportive care to someone. You're nursing them back to health, you're nourishing them, you're doing what you can to, like I said, give ease and comfort. And I would say that this is probably a majority of the actual healthcare activity in human culture, is just people who are not necessarily professionals taking care of people who are sick. If you think about your own childhood, for instance, you probably had more days where you were homesick and being taken care of than you had where you were, say, in the hospital or anything like that. So it's a very common human experience that has, in different aspects, either been professionalized and commodified or ignored. So it's kind of something that people used to know a lot about how to do, or some people used to know a lot about how to do. It was considered part of domestic life to be able to, it was considered, just a general human skill that you were expected to have to be able to take care of a sick person, or an aged person who was, unwell. And so that's something that I think is really important to understand, even if, even for instance, in clinical practice, I don't do a lot of this. But I don't think I would be a very good clinician if I didn't at least have a grasp on how it works. And I don't think anyone else is either. if they don't have a very good grasp on how it works. And if your primary goal is to take care of family and people close to you, then this is an essential skill. It's a really big part of what you would likely be doing in that context, is providing supportive care. So when you're doing that, there are a couple of main categories that you want to look at. One of which is hydration, making sure that the person is getting enough fluids into their system. Usually, if little kids and old people die of illnesses, more often than not, what they're actually dying of is dehydration, because they don't have a lot of water in their bodies to begin with in a lot of cases. Old people are kind of shriveled and dried out, and little kids are just kind of small to begin with. So they don't have as much room for error in terms of loss of fluids or lack of intake of fluids as people do who are, full-sized, otherwise healthy adult or adolescent people. So making sure that somebody has enough fluid is really essential. And making sure that they're able to keep down fluids is really important too. And sometimes that can be a little bit of a push with someone who's sick, because they might not have any sense of thirst. They might have a lot of nausea that would make them not feel like consuming liquids. Depending on the sickness, they might actually have an active revulsion to water. It might feel really uncomfortable to them. So it's something that you have to know that you can't use thirst as a reliable indicator, really in anyone, but even more so in a sick person. So it's a good idea to keep track of how much fluid someone has taken in and try and encourage them, without nagging them to the point of annoyance if you can help it, but encourage them to get as much fluid as possible. It's also sometimes a good idea to use something that will give them a little bit of calories and a little bit of electrolytes. So if you have a liter of water and you mix in about 5 grams, or about roughly 2 teaspoons of sugar and a 1/4 teaspoon of salt, just a little bit of salt and some sugar, and mix that in with some water, you can keep somebody, that will hydrate somebody better than plain water. And it will give them a little bit of calories, and it will give them a little bit of electrolytes. Because when somebody is sweating a lot, when they're urinating a lot, when they're having diarrhea, they're not just losing pure water, right? They're losing water with other stuff in it. And salt is one of the main things. There are a lot of electrolytes, but salt is one of the main things that will get lost quickly. And so that combination of sugar and salt is a very simple way that you can do that. There are a lot of other products out there that you can buy if they're available. One that I use a lot is called Emergen-C. I always keep it with me in first aid stations and situations like that. It's just, it's got a little bit of sugar in it, and it's got a variety of different electrolytes bound with vitamin C. So for example, it will have calcium ascorbate, which is a calcium molecule attached to a vitamin C molecule. Calcium ion attached to a vitamin C. But anyway, it's got the electrolytes that people need. The vitamin C is kind of extra. I don't know how much good it does, but it's a fizzy drink and people like it. Kids usually find it pretty consumable. Sometimes it's soothing to people's stomachs to have a little bit of a fizzy drink. So I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it seems to be the case. So that's something that that you can buy that's a rehydration, basically a more complicated, fancier version of rehydration salts, like I described with sugar and water. Pedialyte, Gatorade are kind of along the same lines. Gatorade has really way more sugar than it needs to have, and there are artificial flavors and colors and everything like that. So they're not necessarily something you would want to have all the time, but if it makes it easier for people to take them, I really don't have that much of a problem with it. It's not, if you're only doing it some of the time, it's not going to be likely to cause problems for most people. So those are all things that you can get, but it's important to know how to make it yourself too, so that you can be self-sufficient if the case arises that you can't buy some of these things. Let's see. Oh, nice. Something called Kinderlight that is similar to Pedialyte but has no added food color and is organic. That sounds very interesting. I haven't seen that one. There are a few other ones out there. I tried one called, I can't even remember what it was called. I tried one that I didn't like that had artificial sweeteners in it, or something. I think it may have just had stevia in it, but it didn't have sugar, but it was sweet and it tasted kind of like not very good. But some people might find that less objectionable than I did. Another common thing that's traditionally used in this is a drink called switchel. Switchel is made with honey and vinegar instead of salt and sugar. And this was popularized. It was folk medicine before. This person didn't invent it, but a writer named Jarvis, who was a physician and herbalist who wrote about the folk medicines of Vermont, he kind of made it very popular. I think he was writing in the early 1900s, might have been a little before or after that. I don't know exactly the date, but his books are still around. I have a copy of one of his books in Russian, actually, that I got when I was studying folk medicine in the Republic of Kazakhstan. Somebody gave me a series of textbooks that they used, and one of them included a translation of folk medicine of Vermont. Narodnaya medicine. So it's been a very worldwide influential book, and has popularized this drink that some people call Huniger and some people call Switchel. But you can add a little bit of salt to it, and it's got a little bit of vinegar and a little bit of honey, and it makes it. It's a rehydration salt. It's another form of rehydration salts. It's a little more acidic, a little more sour, but it's got a nice flavor to it. Apple cider vinegar and honey, and has pretty agreeable taste. So that's another option, another version of this same idea. And there are lots of different versions of this same idea from different places.
What was his name?
Jarvis.
Jarvis. Thank you.
Yeah. There's another drink that's along the same lines called Kerkade or Jamaica, depending on where you're getting it from. And that's made with hibiscus flowers as the sweet component, sweet and sour component. And then it can have a little bit of salt added to it as well. And the hibiscus flowers give it a bright red color and a sort of slightly sour, fruity flavor. And they give it a little more body. It's not as liquid as water. It's a little bit thicker the way that tea is. It has a different mouthfeel to it. It's very cooling and soothing. And that's something that's used in Mexico, and in variations of it are used in the Caribbean and in the Middle East as well, Northern Africa. So that's another variation on something you can drink that helps to keep you hydrated and gives you a little bit of saline, a little bit of salt and electrolytes. So staying hydrated is really important. Yeah.
Sorry, Bentley, what was it called that you were just describing?
It's called Jamaica, which is spelled like Jamaica. And it's also called Kerkade, which I don't know how to write down in English letters. So it's something that looks like a backwards Z, and then sort of an upside down R, and then another backwards Z, and then I don't know what the next thing is called. And then
Is it Gaelic? Is it Gaelic?
No, it's Arabic. It's Arabic.
Okay, thanks.
But yeah, it's all the same thing. It's hibiscus flower. It's a drink made from hibiscus flowers. So yeah, there all cultures have some kind of an electrolyte drink, pretty much. You know, soup can be a similar type of thing. It's more of a food, but it's liquid. The broth is liquid, you know, so bone broth or vegetable broth. The point is, it's got water in it and it's got salt in it, and it's replacing what you're sweating out, or, you know, what's coming out in urine and feces and so forth. And, you know, people lose electrolytes through vomiting. They also lose electrolytes through discharge of mucus. So, you know, all of the stuff that's coming out of your body is taking minerals with it. So it's really important to put them back in to some extent. And so that's a big part of what you have to do in the course of supportive care. And along with that, it's often a good idea, if someone is losing a lot of fluids through one particular means or another, it can be a good idea to treat that symptomatically. So, you know, we've talked about some things like raspberry leaf tea or oak bark for slowing down diarrhea. Ginger, either in the form of tea, or you can use ginger ale if it's like some that has real ginger in it, like Reed's Ginger Brew, or you can make homemade ginger ale, which I could probably post a recipe for in the comments if I remember to do that. That can be a nice thing to use for nausea. What's that? Sorry. So that can be you know, an important thing to do. Another thing that I really like for nausea, hang on just a second, is putting pressure on a certain point, which is right on the inside of the elbow here, basically right there, just sort of where a little bone sticks out, just above the crease of the elbow. Pressure there, or what I usually do for it, if I can, is heat with a moxa stick. Moxa sticks are rolled up sticks of mugwort. You can buy them. There's a company called Lhasa OMS is who I order them from. You can also make them yourself if you have mugwort growing in your yard. But just lighting this and holding it near the point until it becomes uncomfortably hot, and then taking it away. You don't have to burn it or blister it or anything like that. Doing that on both sides, it's a real good way to relieve nausea. It's something that I've used more times than I can count for various severities of nausea. So that's a situation that can be helpful. I try not to have people want cannabis when they're sick and nauseous unless they really need to. Everybody knows about it, and so it's something that a lot of people tend to want to try when they're feeling sick and nauseous. And the nice thing about it is you don't have to swallow anything if you're taking it in smoke form. But especially if there's pulmonary involvement at all, that can be irritating. And even if there's not, it can make it harder for people to know when they're better if they feel, you know, in an altered mental state, and they don't know whether that's because they're feeling feverish or because they've smoked more weed than they're used to. So, it has its uses, but it's not the first thing I reach for. But a lot of the time it's, something that people use on their own because it's, familiar and somewhat readily available, I suppose. A lot of people keep it around. So treating nausea, treating diarrhea so that people aren't losing as much fluids can be helpful. Although, at least at first, sorry, just a second. Okay. All right, so call coming through. Couldn't. All right, so yeah, at least at first, it's not a good idea to suppress those symptoms completely because they're there for a reason. They're trying to purge the body of whatever pathogen is making the person feel sick. So if somebody has, eaten some bad food, for instance, or they've consumed some something that was contaminated with norovirus, which is a very common virus, that kind of the standard stomach virus. In that case, the body is trying to purge the bacteria or the virus out of the system. And it's doing that through vomiting, through diarrhea, and sometimes through fever. So letting those symptoms run their course can be helpful in getting rid of whatever is making them sick in the first place. So there's always, with supportive care, there's a balance between relieving symptoms so that the person will be more comfortable and letting the condition run its course so that the person can heal, so that they can get whatever is causing them to feel bad out of their system. All right, second. All right, so that's one part of managing fluids. Basically, is one big section of what you would want to do during supportive care.
Where did you say you got your Moxa stick again, please?
It's a company called LHASA OMS. OMS stands for Oriental Medical Supplies, but it's LHASA is LHASA. If you Google that, you should find their website. They're about, I think Moxa sticks are, last time I ordered them, they were about $1 a piece. That was, probably 2 years ago, because I ordered a bunch at once, but so they might be twice that by now. But they're generally not very expensive. So that's can be a good thing to have around. I use Moxa for a lot of things. When I was in Central Asia, I learned about it from some herbalists there, and they used it for kind of everything. And so it was something that I picked up and found interesting and started incorporating into my practice at that time, and have used ever since. So yeah, for nausea, that point is really good with Moxa, and it's also pretty good just with pressure. Let's see. So besides managing fluids, another big part of supportive care is trying to make sure that the person gets the nutrients they need. Now, usually, I don't worry about this for the first couple of days. If somebody has no appetite for 2 days, well, an adult, if they have no appetite for 2 days and they don't feel like eating anything and they don't eat anything, it's not really going to harm them. It can actually, fasting can change your body chemistry in a way that can make it a hostile environment to pathogens too. So it can actually be helpful sometimes. But beyond that, it's can become a problem if it's a longer illness. And so if somebody's got a chronic situation and you're trying to help them get the most out of life or recover from a long illness, something like that, then making sure that they're getting enough protein and enough energy is really important. So those are the two main categories that you have to worry about in the short term, other than water and electrolytes, is protein and energy. And by energy, I mean calories. So you want to make sure that somebody is getting enough calories to run their body. For somebody who's not doing a lot of moving around, that's probably 1,000 to 1,500 calories. For somebody who's doing an average amount of moving around, probably around 2,000 calories, give or take a little bit. So finding things that they feel comfortable eating is the trick there, and you just kind of have to play that by ear to some extent. Softer things are often easier. More cooked things are often easier. Protein is really important. It doesn't have to be meat, though. A lot of the time people think of protein and they think of meat. Meat is one source of protein, but it's not always the easiest to digest, especially if you have a weak stomach. So beans can be kind of hard on the system too, of course, but and that differs from person to person. But rice, for instance, is a really good, really edible thing that most people don't have a lot of problem with. It has protein and it has calories. You can live for quite a while on just rice if you have to. Same with corn, depending on the form that the corn is in. You know, corn on the cob is not really all that digestible, but cornmeal, things that are made from cornmeal, are often pretty digestible. Where I'm from, cornmeal and hot water is sort of something that you might give to somebody who's not able to take more solid food. Just sort of like a thin gruel or a thin, almost like horchata, but made out of corn, would be something that you could give to somebody who is not able to digest more solid food. So that's something to be aware of. Besides the stuff that contains protein, fat is a really dense source of calories. So if somebody can take something like a spoonful of coconut oil or a spoonful of olive oil or something like that, it's actually going to have a lot of calories compared to the amount of space it fills up in their stomach and the amount of weight that it feels like in their stomach. So sometimes that can be really helpful. Even like whipping together some oil and some honey is a very traditional way of getting extra calories into somebody that's not readily able to consume calories. So that's something that you can do, and it's something that people usually won't have a lot of objection to. But a couple big spoonfuls of oil and honey is going to contain a lot of calories for what it is. You don't want to give anybody more than about 2 tablespoonfuls of oil in the course of a day, because it will become more than they can digest, and then it will just sort of come out undigested and make everything else come out with it because it's slippery. But 1 or 2 spoonfuls a day can be really helpful and a really good extra source of calories. Besides food and water, air and sunlight are really important for sick people in a way that maybe you don't necessarily feel the need for them as much when you're relatively well. Maybe you are used to working in a warehouse and coming home and going to sleep in a dark room and that sort of thing. But not saying it's great for you, but you can get by with it a lot easier when you're healthy. But when you're sick, air and sunlight can have a really positive effect on how you feel. They can really help to signal to your body that things are okay, to make you feel better. And people being denied those things can be really detrimental to them when they're sick. So, taking a little extra care to help somebody walk outside and get some fresh air, or wheel them outside and get some fresh air if necessary, can make a big difference in how they feel and how fast they recover and really how much hope they have of getting better if they're really sick for a while. You know, if it's a day or two, people can handle anything. But if it starts to get longer than that, it can feel really frustrating to be sick. And I think, you know, most people will experience that at some point in their life, a duration of illness that's longer than that. And most people will probably, maybe not most people, but a lot of people, people who put themselves in a caring and nurturing role are very likely to experience the situation of taking care of someone who is going through an illness that's longer than that. So those are, you know, really useful and generally speaking, free things that are helpful for someone who's going through a long illness. So then another thing that is really important, and this is something that I emphasize a lot, both in my clinical practice and in my just talking about health in general, is that getting adequate sleep, helping the person to get adequate sleep is critically important for healing from just about anything. You know, you can't really be very healthy. You can't be at your best. You can't have your best chance of having radiant health or even adequate health or recovering your health if you're not getting good sleep. And that's so often a barrier to people trying to heal, especially if they're in a situation like a hospital where they're constantly being woken up, where there's always a lot going on around them. So if at all possible, if somebody is sick in a house full of people, it's good to have them have a little bit of space apart to whatever extent the setup of the house allows. You know, might mean rearranging where people are sleeping for a night or two or something like that, but making sure that someone can get adequate sleep for the time that they're recovering is really important. So sometimes that means treating them with things like the skullcap that we talked about, like the passion flower that we talked about before, that help people sleep. Chamomile is another one. Those are all good herbs for helping people who are not sleepy because they're uncomfortable to get better sleep, to get to sleep. So that's important. Making sure that the person is not too hot or too cold is important. Sometimes when people are sick, temperature feels different to them than it normally would, as I'm sure you've all experienced at some point. You can have a fever that makes you feel really hot, or you can have a sweat that makes you feel really cold. So, you know, having someone who's able to help them with that is important. That can include, you know, changing the weight of the bedding that's on them, maybe sometimes wiping somebody down with a wet washcloth, or getting them a wet washcloth so they can wipe themselves down with it, or whatever, to help them cool off, or, you know, making sure they have enough blankets to stay warm, whichever direction they seem to need to go. Having somebody there is just really important. Like I said, sleep aids like chamomile. Chamomile is my favorite one, usually for somebody who's sick and needs sleep. It's mild. Lavender can be another nice one too, because it will break up congestion as well as helping to promote sleep. So those are some good things to help people sleep. And then often treating other symptoms can help people sleep as well. So if somebody has a lot of fever, that might make it hard for them to sleep. And you might say, okay, we're going to give this person a dose of violet syrup to bring their fever down, or some willow bark tea to bring their fever down, so that they'll be able to sleep. And, you know, maybe during the day you won't worry about that so much, but you might want to do that so that they can sleep more easily. So that's something to be aware of. Pain is another thing that keeps people from sleeping. A lot of the time when people require supportive care, they're also in pain, and that can be in the form of body aches, can be in the form of specific localized pain that's from an injury or damage or something like that. So giving them something to help with pain is really, really useful. We haven't gotten really into sedative pain relievers yet in this class. There are some out there, but even things that are non-sedating that are able to treat pain, like the willow bark, for example, but also things like ginger, which I mentioned earlier for nausea, can help with pain. And so trying to ease that is an important part of helping people to sleep, and it can be an important part of just improving the quality of how they're feeling and what's going on with them during the course of their days as well. No, just a second, I'll be right back. Okay. So treating those kind of symptoms can be useful. Getting light exercise is often really helpful. This doesn't necessarily mean that what is appropriate is going to depend on how sick somebody is, obviously. And sometimes people can't get up out of bed. But even sometimes for people to take a few steps, move a little bit, go into a different room, change of scenery, that kind of thing, it can make a huge difference. And getting up and moving around can change how aware they feel, how strong, awake, hopeful, that sort of thing that somebody feels. So all of those things are really useful. There are also herbs that kind of have a traditional use for helping with convalescent, what we might call convalescent aids, things that are sort of tonics that help the body to recover from sicknesses. One really good example from the local healing traditions is an herb called bone set. Bone set is Eupatorium, is genus name. It has white flowers and it has a stem that appears to go up through the middle of leaves. So it's called Perfoliatum, is the species name. It makes a very bitter aromatic tonic. And when somebody takes it, it does a few different things in their body. It makes them sweat. It makes their digestive juices move. And it relieves pain as well. And it also is a little bit decongestant as well. So it does a whole bunch of different things, and probably it does other things that we don't really know about too. But it stimulates the liver, stimulates the bowels and the sweat glands and the digestive system. And it does a bunch of different little things rather than one big thing that all help people feel better after an illness, or help people to feel more recovered from an illness or recover faster. Ginseng is another herb that's traditionally used in this way. Ginseng is also what you call blood moving. It increases circulation. It contains a bunch of steroidal substances, a bunch of similar shaped molecules that consist of the way they're set up is that they have this one particular shape of molecular nucleus, kind of the main part of the molecule, that has 17 carbons arranged into the shape of sort of like 3 hexagons and a pentagon. And then attached to that, they have a sugar molecule. And these are called glycosides, or in this case, steroidal saponicides. But they interact with the endocrine system. And in interacting with the endocrine system, They tend to make people feel more energetic. They make them feel less inflamed, less pain, less inflammation, less runny nose, less upset stomach. Anything that involves inflammation, they're going to decrease that inflammation, which is, so it's going to kind of help to counteract a whole wide range of symptoms. And they make people feel more energetic, and they also make people hungrier. Sometimes they make people mad too. Sometimes they make people feel angry. So there is a possibility of like mood swing type situations. But on the whole, ginseng and some other herbs like it, including the Aurelias, which in our region would be Aurelia spinosa, Aurelia nudicalis. Those are the main two. Aurelia racemosa. They're all kind of distantly related to ginseng. Ivy leaf contains some of the same stuff. That's not poison ivy. That's how like the actual heterohelix ivy. So all of these things, they contain these same types of substances that sort of mask a wide range of symptoms or counteract a wide range of symptoms, and also increase energy and appetite. So those types of things can be really good for helping somebody to recover from an illness. You don't really want to give them to somebody necessarily at the beginning of an illness when there's a lot of fever and that sort of thing, because they might make the fever worse, and they might actually keep the body from fighting the infection as effectively, because things that suppress inflammation are actually kind of turning off certain messaging messaging systems in the immune system, messaging processes in the immune system. So you don't want to give them, or it's a tricky thing to give them during an acute illness, because they might actually make it worse. But while keeping the symptoms better, they might allow the underlying condition to get worse. But when somebody's already on the mend and you're kind of past the danger of that happening, they can be really helpful for putting the life back into somebody, making them feel like they can get up, like they have an appetite, like they want to do stuff. Sometimes they make people feel restless, like I said, sometimes even angry, which is, unpleasant when that happens, when you're taking care of someone and they start yelling at you. But if you know that it's because they're on drugs, then it's not necessarily as personal. But usually that doesn't happen with ginseng. Usually it happens in people who kind of tend towards that sort of thing anyway. But it's something to be aware that can happen. They can make people feel more aggressive, but they also make people feel more energetic. So that's ginseng and several other plants that we might sometimes describe as adaptogens that are in the same family. And those are things that, in Appalachian folk medicine, these would very much be things that would be used as convalescent aids for helping people to get over an illness, helping people to recover their strength and vitality after an illness. And so they can be really good to know about in the course of supportive care. Some other symptoms that you might want to treat during something like that would be respiratory symptoms, which, there are a lot of herbs, aromatic herbs tend to be expectorant, tend to break up congestion. Ginger is one I've already mentioned that can do some things like that. Various different mints, anything spicy like cayenne, how it is when you're eating something that's really spicy with cayenne, it can make your nose run. So that's a useful thing to take in this sort of situation. And then soothing herbs can also be helpful. If there's been a lot of coughing, if there's been a lot of vomiting, usually somebody's throat's really raw, that can make them not want to eat. So something like slippery elm or marshmallow can help with that. Or sea moss, which we talked about before, can help with that as well. You want to use these sparingly in somebody who's had diarrhea, because they can be kind of slippery, and that can lead to looser bowels. But if it's just somebody that's had a lot of vomiting, had some sore throat, something like that, that can be really helpful. So on the whole, making sure somebody is having comfortable as far as, well, managing their fluids, managing their symptoms for the sake of comfort and for sleep, helping to promote sleep actively, helping to treat various different symptoms and after effects caused by the illness process, and then giving them convalescent aids to help them recover. It's also really good to help see to their needs, and psychologically, making sure they have things like a comfortable place to be. Distractions can be really helpful, whether that's Netflix or something to read, or sometimes just conversation, although people aren't always up for conversation when they're very sick. So it's important to be sensitive to that too. So, trying to some extent take their lead, but without asking them a lot of questions about what they need if you don't have to. So you're talking about, I have a question about like when there's too much fluids, like maybe accumulating around organs and things like that. So that I would consider that to be a form of stagnation, like when we talked about that a few weeks ago. And so that's stagnation of fluids or accumulation of fluids. And you would want to deal with those either if it's just in someone's abdomen or in their tissues, through the organs that get rid of fluid, which would often be the kidneys especially. So using something that stimulates the kidneys can be really helpful there. Using decongestant things and decreasing inflammation if it's in the respiratory system, because fluid accumulates a lot of the time as a result of inflammation, as a response to inflammation. So decreasing the inflammation, which might mean getting rid of infection, can be something that you might have to do. So that can be a lot to manage. That can be sometimes, if there is accumulation of fluid, it's a more complicated case if there's an accumulation of fluid in and around the organs. But in general, you would want to treat it by strengthening the kidneys, stimulating the kidneys to try and get more fluid out of the system. There are also decongestants that are diuretic, that we'll get into a little bit later on, that are kind of slightly more advanced herbs to use. Things like ephedra and green citrus peel. But yeah, a lot of the time it's still about reducing stagnation and reducing inflammation. And so, and sometimes it's about, an organ needing additional support, like the kidneys or like the lymph system needing some additional support to help move fluids that aren't moving the way that they should be. But even then, it's often inflammation that's causing that. So yeah, a lot of it's really basic. A lot of it's stuff that you would probably figure out on your own, maybe. Food, fluids, sleep, comfort, distraction, soothing, that sort of thing. But it's good to, have plans for, and it's good to have practice with. A lot of the time, people who've, spent their life taking care of other people will often have their sort of go-to remedies and things that they would use if somebody's sick, whether that's, chicken soup and crackers and Sprite, or whether it's, certain herbal remedies and things like that. But a lot of the time it's about comfort and about acceptable foods and things of that nature, and about relieving symptoms. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a couple of different herbs this week. The first one I wanted to talk about is mustard. And this kind of ties in with this because mustard has been used a lot for in supportive care for sick people. So when I say mustard, I mean mustard seeds or powdered mustard seeds. This is something that you really don't see being talked about much in herbal medicine circles. I don't really see, mustard-based remedies on the shelf in the health food store or anything like that. Although if you read stories from past generations about people treating sick people at home, mustard often comes into it. So a very simple way of applying it, a lot of the time, mustard is spicy. And so it moves fluid, it's spicy, it's irritating, and it's sulfury. And as a sulfury substance, it does decrease inflammation throughout the body, even though it might cause some irritation locally that would increase inflammation topically. One way that this is applied is in the form of a mustard plaster. Mustard plasters are basically pieces of paper that have been treated with powdered mustard and vinegar mixed together, or it doesn't have to be vinegar. It could be powdered mustard with alcohol or water or even oil. Mustard contains some volatile oils, but they do disperse pretty well in water and alcohol too. So it will kind of dissolve in just about anything. But in this case, it's actually more like dispersing than dissolving. You take mustard seeds, powder them, which you can buy mustard already powdered, and then mix that with a little bit of something to make it wet, and then soak a piece of paper in that, a little strip of paper, and then apply that to the chest, or apply a series of them to the chest. And that will actually increase circulation to the area, provoke coughing, break up congestion, open up the airways, hopefully, and ultimately result in more free airways. These same plasters have also been used on the head for headaches because they irritate the surface, which causes there to be less irritation further down. So it's called a rubefacient or a counter irritant, where it's basically making you feel mild pain in a more superficial, more innervated area, because there's more nerve endings in the skin than there are deeper in, and drawing away from the pain in muscles and further in. So that's actually, a way that it's been used to treat pain, headaches, muscle tension, things like that. You can do a mustard plaster, which is the piece of paper soaked in the powdered mustard mixed with a liquid, or you can make an oil infusion of the mustard, which I find to be a lot cleaner and easier to use. And it's maybe not as dramatic in its effect, but it is it's kind of more acceptable to people who aren't used to it, because having some oil rubbed on your skin isn't as weird as having, an herb soaked piece of paper laid on your skin. But the plasters are good. They actually last longer. They kind of continue transferring mustardy substances into your skin for longer. So they can be used for things like patches for lower back pain or knee pain, be put on an arthritic joint or something like that. And they're really useful for that. But the oil is too. The oil can be used in that way too. And so that's usually how I do it. Mustard, by the way, is a bunch of different plants, but for the purposes of this, Sinapis alba, which is sometimes called Brassica alba, is white mustard, and also hot mustard, which is just kind of a more spicy cultivated variety of it. There's also black mustard or brown mustard, which is the same species, Brassica nigra, and that one has sort of dark brown to black seeds. The one that's called white mustard has you guessed it, yellow seeds. They're sort of, they're not the color of yellow mustard that comes in a squeeze bottle, but they're more like the color of, they're a lighter yellow color. And so these, if you want to make an oil out of it, the easiest way to do it is to warm some oil to like maybe 100 degrees or 212 degrees or so, depending on which system of temperature you're using, and then mix in a teaspoon of the mustard powder per ounce of oil that you're heating up. Mix it together and then let it steep overnight. Give it another good mixing and then strain it through a coffee filter or some other similar thing that's going to be fine enough to filter out the pieces of the powder. If you want to make it out of whole seeds, it's going to take a lot longer to really get. You would want to keep it. You'd want to let it steep for a couple weeks because they're hard and the oils don't come out of them as easily as they do out of the powder. So I usually would make it out of the powder of hot mustard powder, which you can buy in the spice section of the grocery store usually. You can also order it from Frontier Co-op. So this mustard oil is pretty potent, pretty spicy, feels very warming on the skin, and it can be used on sore joints, especially any kind of pain that is made worse by the cold. And it can be used on the chest to break up congestion. It can also be used here and up here and here to break up sinus congestion. And it works pretty well. Oh, and just like a little bit below the ear on each side also helps the ears and sinuses to drain. It can be taken internally. That's kind of a dramatic measure. You can swallow it. You can put a little bit of it on your finger and snort it up your nose to break up congestion, but it's painful and it's kind of a, in my opinion, unnecessarily heroic measure, dramatic measure that gets fast results, but not necessarily better results long term than just putting it on the skin. But it's a good herb to know if you. It's an easy thing to grow if you're growing your own food. Mustard greens are a really easy plant to grow a lot of. They don't need a lot of. They can grow in kind of a little bit shadier of an area, and some of them, if they flower and go to seed, you get a lot of seeds out of. You can get a lot of seeds out of a small area. There's also other mustard plants that grow wild that you can find the seeds of. Even there are brassicas, but there's also Aliaria, which is called garlic mustard, and it goes to seed around this time of year, or really starting earlier than this and continuing into the winter. You can find the seed pods in areas where it's been introduced. It tends to grow under trees in urban and suburban areas, like in little forested areas. It's a very, very invasive plant because most animals won't eat it. It's kind of garlicky and mustardy, as the name implies. But the seeds of it are going to have a lot of the same substances. They have some other ones too, some different sulfur compounds, but they have a lot of the same sulfury compounds as the hot mustard or white mustard or black mustard would have. So these are all, readily accessible, very powerful and non-toxic for the most part. At least at any normally consumable dose, it's non-toxic. Herbs that are, pretty easy to come by, generally speaking. So that's the kind of thing I like to teach about. And like I said, in this case, it has a very long history of use as a home remedy. It's not a popular thing in the herb world. It's not something that people are doing a lot of buying and selling of as an herbal remedy. even though it does have a long history of use and it does have a wide variety of different applications. But it can be unpleasant because it's spicy and because it's, sulfury and that sort of thing. So, maybe some people would find it disagreeable on those grounds. Personally, I think it's a really good herb to have in your toolkit, really good one to know about and be able to employ when the situation calls for it. It's also kind of got something of a religious significance, because there was a parable of the mustard seed in the Gospels, and people have kind of thought of the mustard seed as a symbol of faith because of that, which I think is kind of just sort of a neat cultural aside. Doesn't necessarily directly affect its medicinal properties, but it's a good familiar vegetable food type herb. Not something that has a lot of potential for interactions, especially when it's used topically. When it is taken internally as food, it does increase warmth, sensation of warmth, and increased circulation in the digestive system. Can be decongestant, like I said, can cause some drainage and that sort of thing. But it's really good as an expectorant, and that's kind of more than anything, that's what I would think of it as being, is something that can be used topically as an expectorant, which is most expectorants are not topical. They're things that are taken internally, but when somebody's really congested, they might not feel like taking much internally. And so it can be, useful to have some things like camphorated salve or hot mustard oil that are used topically as expectorants. Just a second. Whoa. Okay. All right. So, and like I said, it can be used for the joints. When it is used for the joints, it's not only is it a counter irritant that's producing circulation in the areas and relieving pain from deeper tissue by irritating and warming more superficial tissue, it also actually does contain some anti-inflammatory sulfur compounds. And if it's used topically on an area of the skin where there's infection, it might not feel very good. It might burn, but it will kill off things like impetigo, which is a skin infection. It does tend to work against that, which can be, it's often not that bad of an infection, but it can become severe. So it's I guess you could say bactericidal, anti-infective when it's used topically, and it's anti-inflammatory. It's applied to the soles of the feet. Some people say they can taste it. So it's actually getting absorbed through the skin and circulating in the bloodstream, according to that idea. I've never actually been able to taste it myself. I just might not be able to taste things through my feet as well as some other people. But people do say that that's a thing that you can do. So it does appear that at least some of it is absorbed through the skin. And in very small amounts, like a few drops at a time with food, it can help to promote digestion by stimulating the insides of the digestive system. So it's a good all around good herb to know about, even though it's kind of, I feel like one that's sort of been, that was very popular and very widely used for many, many generations, and then has just kind of been mostly forgotten, or I kind of think almost like looked down upon because it wasn't a prestigious exotic thing. It was something that, you know, poor people grew in their gardens to eat, and the seeds were sort of something extra from that. I can't exactly say why, but strangely enough, it's not as much of a remedy as it used to be, or not as widely used of a remedy as it used to be. Then the next, oh, sorry, did I miss a question? Oh yeah, question about using it for plantar fasciitis. Yeah, you can use it for plantar fasciitis as a rub on the bottoms of the feet, and using it along with stretching is really helpful, because stretching probably helps plantar fasciitis nearly as much as anything else, or is maybe that by itself isn't sufficient, but I think it's necessary for helping someone to recover from plantar fasciitis, because as the plantar fascia, the bundles of tissue along the underside of the foot, as they become inflamed, they tense up, and so stretching that out can be really helpful. Warming it, as the mustard would do, is really helpful. And then sometimes you would want to take an internal anti-inflammatory as well if it was severe. Turmeric is something that I would often use in that situation. Just a very simple, well-tolerated anti-inflammatory that can be used in fairly large quantities. All right. Any questions about mustard seed before I go on? All right, so the next one that I wanted to talk about is elder. Elder is a tree. It's a very small tree. Sometimes it's more like a bush. There are a few different medicinal substances that come from it. There's the bark, which is not much used anymore. The leaf is kind of used similarly to the bark, and then the flower and the berries. The berries are the part that I use the most frequently. And in the last couple of years, it's been one of the herbs that I've used the very most of. The bark is a strong laxative. It's what you might call a purgative or a cathartic laxative. It's something that, well, yeah, it's a stimulant laxative actually. It's when it's digested, some of the substances that are in the bark get broken down by the gut bacteria and turned into different substances that cause really strong contraction of the intestinal walls. And so it really kind of can cause cramping and causes everything to get pushed out kind of somewhat forcefully. So it's a very strong laxative. And as such, it's not something I use very often. There are a lot of herbs that are very strong laxatives like that. And in the plants, it's mainly there as a defense mechanism to keep grazing animals from eating them. And elder bark has some of that in it. Leaves have a little bit of it in it. They also contain something called cyanogenic glycosides, which are basically like a cough suppressant, sort of like what's in cherry bark. and they can be slightly toxic at larger doses too. So a very large dose of elder tree bark can cause vomiting. A somewhat smaller to medium-sized dose can cause very strong diarrhea. I don't really like to cause diarrhea or vomiting in people. There was a certain time in the history of medicine when doing that was like, very much sought after, something that people really liked to do because it was an outwardly visible sign that stuff was being purged from the body. And that was more like when they had these ideas that, too much bile was the cause of a lot of illness. So if you're puking out a bunch of bile, that must mean you're getting healthier. And I don't necessarily see that as being correct. I think sometimes it's just that you made the person sick, and that's not necessarily something you need to do. So I don't use that remedy very much, but it might be something. I use that type of laxative in situations where somebody has been on opioids or other drugs that would keep their digestive system from moving, to get it moving again. So that's a scenario where it might make sense to use elder bark if that's what you had. I usually use buckthorn bark for that because mostly because I'm letting the elders go to fruit because I don't want them to make berries, and I don't want to cut them down or anything like that. The flowers of elder are a much milder laxative. They don't usually cause projectile diarrhea or anything, but they do tend to help things to move a little more. So I consider them basically food. They're like a high fiber food that has a little bit of these substances that help to cause muscular contractions in the digestive tract. So it is a little bit laxative. It's not purely just that it contains fiber, but it's not very strong. It's not forceful. It's not pronounced like that. So elder flowers can be mixed in with batter and made into pancakes. That's the only way I've consumed them in recent years. They can also be made into a flower water or a syrup or a tea. That's going to have these mildly sweat-inducing, mildly fever-reducing, and mildly laxative properties. So that's been used for all that for a long time, and it's pretty good for that. But I usually don't use it that way very much because if you pick the flowers, it doesn't turn into berries. And so I usually just let it go to fruit and use the berries. And the berries are very rich in antioxidants. They contain the same standard purple class of substances as a lot of other soft purple fruits like blackberries and grapes. These are called proanthocyanidins. They're antioxidants, they're anti-inflammatory. And that's probably part of what makes elder do what it does. It's definitely a part that's been studied. There's more to what's going on with them than just that. Usually, I make elder into a couple different preparations. The one that I use the most is a syrup, which is made by cooking the juice down and adding some sugar to it to help preserve it. And in addition to that, elderberry wine, which is made by basically just fermenting the elderberry juice, actually concentrate it and then ferment it. So it's kind of the same thing that I would be making the syrup out of, except instead of adding sugar, melting sugar in it, I'm just adding yeast to it and letting it ferment. And this kind of produces a carbonated, slightly fizzy, not very alcoholic product. I don't let it ferment until it becomes still, which would be more alcoholic and less fizzy, but it would take weeks longer. It still takes a couple of weeks, but that would take longer. So I just make it into a slightly fermented elderberry wine. And that's kind of the form that I use probably the very most. And I'd say I've probably, since the pandemic began, I probably used 50 gallons of the stuff. I also make tinctures of dried berries, which is kind of fairly similar. It's higher in alcohol though. So yeah, various different forms of making it. My daughter Aoife, for a while, especially kind of at the height of the viral surges, was making elderberry gummies and selling a lot of those, which are just, you know, gummy bears with concentrated elderberry in them. So they actually, a lot of the commercial ones contain just a nominal amount of elderberry. And so we noticed that they would maybe contain a fraction of a gram of elderberry. And we made ones where, you know, there was basically like 5 grams of elderberry being made into each one of the gummy bears. So it had a much more noticeable effect. So it is not a low dose medicine. It's not something that you would want to take a fraction of a gram and expect it to really do a lot of good. It is, however, something that there's a lot of evidence that it does help some with febrile illnesses. With the term they use in the literature is influenza-like illnesses, or ILIs. But you know, a lot of the time we were seeing this with COVID-19 is what we were using it a lot for. And I give it to people, and I take it myself as sort of a preventative measure for just kind of keeping the immune system a little bit ramped up, keeping a lot of antioxidants on board, doing their free radical scavenging thing. But if somebody has a fever and you give them elderberry, a lot of the time what you notice is the fever goes up a little bit at the very beginning. It'll go up a degree or so. And sometimes people find that alarming. But it's modulating the process or the production of certain chemicals that are involved in the inflammatory and fever producing process. These substances called cytokines, which are basically messenger molecules that tell the cells to get moving. And so it's motivating the immune system in a way. And so sometimes at first you will see a change in temperature that's actually not the direction you would usually want to go, but that comes back down after a little bit, and then people start feeling better. So most of the literature on elderberry suggests that people kind of get back to normal a day or so earlier with elderberry than without. So it's something that shortens the duration of illnesses, usually kind of results in less missed work, less days where you can't take care of what you need to take care of and maybe need to be taken care of instead. I'm not entirely sure how well it works as a preventative, because that's a very difficult thing to measure. And so I haven't seen any really systematic data that does measure that, but I feel like it helps. It seems to me from my own experience like it probably helps. But again, it's not something that can easily be quantified just by observation, because you have to have a whole bunch of really similar people, and some of whom took elderberry and some of them didn't, and seeing who had the most average reactions to sickness, with all other things being equal, which of course all other things hardly ever are equal. So it can be really hard to get a good fix on that sort of thing, to make an accurate measurement of that sort of thing, or to actually study it in a way that makes that gives you a clear answer. But it's pretty easy to take, and there's not much downside to it. It's, you know, it's just berries. Some people say that when they eat fresh elderberries, it makes them sick. I've never experienced this myself. I've eaten handfuls of them every year since I was a little kid. Pick them and eat them straight, and I've never had the least problem with that. Some people do report that it gives them bad vomiting and that sort of thing, but that goes away after it's been cooked. So it's not an issue with preparations of it, like tinctures or syrups or whatever, that have even been where the elderberries have either been dried or have been cooked or something like that. And that may be about the presence of certain substances in it that produce cyanide in small amounts, or it may not have anything to do with that. It may be some other class of substances. But elderberry is good for helping the immune system and providing some symptomatic relief during cold and flu-like illnesses. And it's been a real favorite of mine. It's been one of the it, along with usnea and lemon balm, has been kind of like the standard thing that I've given to a lot of people during the course of the pandemic, and I feel like has been incredibly helpful. And a lot of people have said that they've noticed the difference when they've stopped taking it and things like that as well. So elderberry is a good herb to know about. It's one of the few herbs that I actually have a recipe from my family from the old days. I have a lot of things where I know that they used certain herbs, but I don't usually have like actual recipes and formulas and stuff. But I do have one for an elderberry syrup that actually uses 5 pounds of sugar to every pound of elderberries, which is not the way I'm going to make it, because I feel like that's excessive on the sugar side of things, but it's the way my great grandmother made it. And I think it's interesting to know about that. And she was an herbalist back during the 1918 pandemic. So it's nice to have that connection. And don't know as much about how elderberry was used specifically by my family in previous times, but I know that it is an herb that was used in Ireland where we lived, and has been part of the folk medicine there, as well as throughout the rest of Europe and probably other areas as well, because there are native elderberries in Europe and parts of Asia, and there are native elderberries here in the eastern United States that are very similar, probably the same species, maybe a slightly different species, depending on who you ask. And then out west, there are some different species of elderberries that look more powdery blue colored rather than dark purple colored. So there are different species of elderberries growing in a lot of different places, but they all have fairly similar, or all the purple ones have fairly similar substances in them and fairly similar medicinal uses.
Hey, Andrew, I have a quick question about elderberry and COVID. So back when everything was very new, I was giving my kids elderberry, but then a family member had said something about it causing a cytokine storm or something, which I didn't believe, and I kind of ignored it. But is there any truth to that, or is that something that was made up by somebody?
It's something that was made up by somebody who shall remain nameless, but they kind of brought it up as a theoretical possibility. And then it sort of spread like a wild rumor, as though it was something that had actually been observed when it wasn't. And to this day, nobody has ever seen it happen. Elderberry does modulate cytokines somewhat. Cytokine storm is something that tends to happen in very end stage situations where someone is dying already, and so they probably wouldn't be taking elderberry in that situation anyway. It's sort of a last ditch effort that the body makes to kind of kill off bacteria, but it usually destroys the lungs as well. So no, that's not really something that really happened. It's something that that an herbalist brought up as a possibility, and that a lot of people kind of freaked out about, or, you know, I don't know exactly what the motivation or the psychology was behind it, but it got passed around as though it were, you know, something you really had to be careful of, when it was just, you know, someone's misguided idea of a possibility, but it really wasn't even much of a possibility. It was just, you know, something that they thought was a possibility based on kind of an incomplete understanding of what cytokine storm was. But no, elderberry is a really safe herb, and, you know, a really safe food. It's, you know, not any more dangerous than, say, grapes or blueberries. It's really a very safe remedy. And, you know, I've at this point, I've given it to thousands of people who actively had COVID. And I don't even know how many people who were around COVID and might get it, and that sort of thing. So yeah,
I kind of figured it was like a made up thing anyway.
Yeah.
I just wanted to confirm.
Yeah, kind of a made up thing. Nice. Yeah. So I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you for clearing that up.
Yeah, for sure. It's something that a lot of people have asked about over the last couple of years. And you know, I've before COVID, I used the same combination of herbs for other respiratory viruses. And so it was not exactly like a new thing or anything, but yeah, for some reason there was this idea that it would, you know, somehow cause a disastrous situation, but that never happened. Even though, you know, I would say altogether it's probably been given to many millions of people at this point for COVID, not just by me, but by the world in general. And so it's a really good herb to keep on hand. It's a really good versatile herb for illnesses. And if you have it in like the elderberry syrup form, especially, something that you can easily give to children. I always, when my kids were sick, I often gave them this stuff called Well Child. That was a formula made by Michael Tierra, who was sort of a mentor to me earlier on in my career. And it's elderberry syrup is one of the main things in it. And it's, you know, something I used for my babies a lot, my children when they were small. It's a good thing. It's got a bunch of different stuff in it, but elderberry is kind of the main, the predominating flavor to it, at least. Yeah. So yeah, elderberry is getting ripe right now. If you have it around, it often grows along fences, ditches, edges of woods, kind of what you might call liminal spaces, borders between one thing and another. But yeah, a lot of the time, right alongside fence rows is where I often am used to seeing it. Birds will eat it. So sometimes if you have some that you want to gather, it can be a good idea to put a little bit of netting over it or mesh or something like that to keep the birds from getting it. You can't really pick it and then ripen it the way you can some fruit. You just kind of have to take your chances. But a lot of the time you can get it. If you keep an eye on it, you can get it as soon as it turns ripe, and then start picking it before the birds eat it all, because they love it. And I always leave them some when I'm harvesting. I usually will. Usually, if I'm harvesting elderberries, I'll take some scissors. It grows in a big umbel. The inflorescence is like a big a big umbrella shaped cluster. I'll usually go and clip off 2/3 of those that are growing on a particular bush and leave the other third for the other creatures. Sometimes I do less than that, but you know, it's a fruit, so the plant's going to keep coming back and coming back. And then usually once I've picked it, I freeze them, put them in Ziploc bags and freeze them, or rinse them and then put them in Ziploc bags and freeze them. And then while they're frozen, kind of knock the berries off of the stems. So it can be hard to separate the berries from the stems, but that's the easiest way that I've found to do it is to cut the whole umbel and then freeze it. I've thought about making a tool for it that's sort of like a blueberry rake, which is basically like a giant comb, or a cross between a comb and a dustpan, but with smaller tines for the size of elderberries. I thought about making a tool like that, but I've never gotten around to it. It would be pretty simple to make out of sheet metal, though, if somebody felt particularly enterprising. But usually I just snip the umbels off with edge clippers or big scissors, and just put those in a basket and then put the stuff in bags and freeze it, and then knock the berries off while it's frozen. It seems to separate the stems from the berries pretty well. So yeah, it can be an ordeal to process, but if you find a good stand of it, you can get a lot of it at a time, and you know, make it into something you can actually keep the berries frozen. If you have a freezer, you can keep the berries frozen until you're ready to use them, and you know, make a batch of syrup and use that up. You can, if you add enough sugar, the syrup will be shelf stable and not develop mold. Like I said, I often make it into wine, which can be extremely well, I've had situations where I opened it and it kind of, you know, fountained everywhere like champagne. Got the other day, well, this has been more than a month ago, but I opened a bottle of it and it just sort of went boom and exploded all over the room. Got on the ceiling, got on all 4 walls of the room that I was in. That room out there, and made a huge mess. But you know, if you let it ferment long enough, it won't do that anymore. I just bottled it before it was entirely done, so it produced a lot of carbonation. So yeah, it's a good herb to have, and I feel like it does have some calming, relaxing effect as well. It seems to be sort of it has a smell to it that's like a faint version of valerian. So I think that it contains some isovaleric acid, which is something that calms the nerves, substance that acts on the nerves as well. So you know, probably is that probably contributes to its medicinal properties as well. So yeah, it's a really good a good wild food / wild medicine to know about and to cultivate a relationship with. If you have elderberries growing near you, like I said, leave some for the birds. The birds will plant more elderberry bushes because they, you know, eat and distribute the seeds, and the seeds will grow along the same fence rows where the original one was growing, and you can get a really good stand going after a few years. And you know, you can harvest from the same spot for years and years, since it's a tree and it can live a pretty long time. But it's also kind of a weedy tree, so it doesn't require a lot of cultivation or pruning or anything like that a lot of other fruit trees would. It just kind of it grows and it does its thing, and you don't really have to intervene with it a whole lot, except when you're ready to harvest from it. So it's a good plant to know about. Oh, also the stems are hollow. They can be, they've got pith in the middle, which can be pushed out with a wire or a thinner stick or something like that. And it can be a good source of hollow stems, which can be used as straws and for various other things where you would need a hollow tube, pipe stems, things like that. So it's got a variety of craft and instrument making potential as well. Just a second. Okay, so elder leaf. I don't really use elder leaf very much. Elder leaf contains some of the stuff that's in the berries and some of the stuff that's in the bark. So it does contain some antioxidant properties. It does contain some cough suppressant properties. If I was going to use it for anything, that's probably what I would use it for, is its cough suppressant properties. And it is a little bit of a laxative as well. It does seem to have some of the fever modulating properties that the berries have, but I think, to me, not as pronounced. It hasn't been nearly as researched, so I can't really point to a study that says that the berries work like this and the leaves work like this as far as how fever reducing they are. But my experience is that it's not as much. Doesn't change the fever as much. But it does have more of the cough suppressant property to it. So yeah, I don't use the leaves as much mainly because I use the berry. And if you're taking energy from the plant in any other way, if you're taking the leaves, the leaves aren't going to be there to gather up sunlight to make into the calories in the berries. So, if you gather the bark, obviously that part of the tree isn't going to be alive anymore to make berries. And if you pick the flowers, they won't turn into berries. So usually I leave everything else alone except the berries, because that's the main part that I want. But every part does have its medicinal properties. And for the leaves, I would say that their strongest point is that they're a cough suppressant. And like I said before, well, I think I've mentioned this before, I don't really love cough suppressants as a concept. When somebody has a dry, spastic cough, that can be helpful to have a cough suppressant. Or when somebody is just unable to sleep because they've got a racking cough, sometimes it can help with that situation as well. But most of the time when somebody's coughing, it's because they're trying to clear stuff out of their airway. And I really don't want stuff to accumulate in somebody's airway that needs to be expelled. So usually what I do instead of a cough suppressant is an expectorant that's going to help break up the congestion and bring things out. For example, this week I gathered pine cones and pine resin, which are a good expectorant. There are lots of them, but that's one that I use fairly often is white pine. I think I talked about that in our first week's class, and it's one that I use a lot. That's kind of in season right now. Pine trees are dripping resin right now. If you ever want to go gather some, this is a good time to do it, because white pine, at least in my area, their cones are reaching maturity, and so there's a lot of juices flowing through them, through the whole tree, as they're bringing in the cones to maturity. They don't have the springtime sap run that a deciduous plant would have, where they're putting out leaves, because they have leaves all year. So you get the most flow of their sap when they're putting out cones. So yeah, I don't love cough suppressants. They're not something that I reach for a lot, but elder leaf is a cough suppressant, and is something kind of along the same lines as cherry bark in terms of what's in it that makes it do what it does. So that's something that if I were going to use it, that's what I would probably use it for. But as it is, I want the berries from it, and the cherry bark is really plentiful in my woods, in the woods where I live. So that's usually what I do instead. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Okay, so any more questions about elder or mustard?
Andrew, my internet kind of went out. You may have already answered my question, but um, is there a contraindication for elderberry in people with some sort of autoimmune disease?
I don't think so. It does increase immune activity very briefly. I mean, it does increase fever, for instance, very briefly. I've never seen it be associated with an autoimmune flare. So I would be inclined to say not generally, although these things can be kind of idiosyncratic from one person to the next. But it's not something that the way that it works doesn't make me think that it would be likely to provoke a problem with autoimmune conditions.
Great, thank you. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem. So Saturday, the 6th is the herb walk, and I went yesterday and kind of scouted out the area and everything. So it's going to be at Tom Dorman Nature Sanctuary, which is, if you're coming from Lexington, you go south on Nicholasville Road, past Nicholasville, and then you cross the bridge into Garrett County. And as soon as you cross the bridge, there is a right turn. That's just sort of a little bit of a little piece of road that dead ends at a gate. And alongside that road, there's a few parking spaces where we can park, and you can walk in from there. If anybody wants to meet at the clinic at 2040 Regency Road and ride share out there, that's something we can do. I have a little bit of space in my car, three spaces in my car, and if anybody wants to carpool out there, we can. So I want to meet there at 11 o'clock and go into the woods from there. And yeah, like I said, if anybody needs a ride out from Lexington, they can meet me at the clinic half an hour before, and we can go out there together. And I think it'll be a really good time to be out in the woods and see some things. Keep in mind that it is sort of a time when there are a lot of ticks and mosquitoes and things like that. So dress accordingly. If you use bug spray or whatever, keep that in mind. Sunscreen as well. And probably bring some water. So it will be a pretty good ways in. I don't think there are any actual facilities of any sort in the nature sanctuary. So if somebody needs to use the bathroom before we get started, there's a Shell station just up the road. But once we get started, we'll just kind of be in the woods. And it's a little more strenuous terrain than the last place that we went, but nothing terrible, I think. And we can kind of it's more ground than we'll be able to cover. So we're not going to see all of it anyway, so we can kind of adjust what parts we look at to the needs of the group. But we should be able to see a couple different types of microhabitat and several interesting medicinal plants growing in the area. Email everyone the detail and directions. Yeah, I'll try and email everybody the details and directions tomorrow or Thursday. And yeah, so there's kind of limited parking at the place. So ride sharing is encouraged if possible. But I realize it might not really be feasible for everybody. So, or for maybe not for anybody, but yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting together with everybody out in a more natural setting. Heisel Farm Park is really interesting and has a lot of good stuff there, but it's also a very human impacted environment. And while it's not like this place has never been impacted by humans, it's much less so, much less a human formed environment than what we saw last time. So we'll get to see some different things and a kind of a different types of plant community. And because it's full forest, it'll be, you know, maybe a more layered type of plant community than what you see in just a field. So I'm really looking forward to it. And for everybody that can't come, we'll try and put together a good video about what we saw there. Yeah. And like I said, with the last one, if anybody wants to bring a friend or bring kids or anything like that, that's okay with me. All right. So any questions about that? Or, like I said, I'll try and email details and directions in writing to everybody. And in case anybody doesn't have it, if you should need to get a hold of me, I'll put my number in the email too, but it's phone number is 859-420-5648. And you're welcome to call or text if you need to. I'm not sure if I'll have reception once I get into the woods. I think I will, at least for part of the time. I know that I do in the parking lot, but it's not that remote of an area. But haven't checked either, so I'm not completely sure. All right, well, that's all I have for now. If anybody has any questions, let me know. And yeah, I look forward to seeing everybody who's going to make it there when we get there. And let's see what is last week's class is on YouTube. Sorry I didn't send out that email when I got it on there. I just got it on there yesterday and just added the description today. So I was kind of been running behind a little bit. Had a pretty eventful week. So, but yeah, last week's class is on, and I will put this week's class on either tomorrow or Thursday and send out an email once it is on, and also send out the email about the herb walk. All right. Well, thank you everybody so much for coming, and I will talk to you all very soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.